On the 4th of July, in front of about 130 of our neighbors and 49 years of signatures in a leather guest book, my ex-fiancé picked up the microphone my grandfather has used every summer since 1975 and told me, kindly, like he was doing me a favor, that maybe I should sit this one out. Behind him, his mother stood holding a program. Not the one my mother prints every June in Comic Sans. Hers said Ashford Family 4th of July celebration, in a font I didn't recognize, on paper I hadn't seen before that morning. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I set down my lemonade, picked up a blue canvas tote bag I'd packed the night before, and asked my grandfather one question in front of everyone. By the time I finished asking it, Connor Ashford wasn't smiling anymore. I want to walk you through this whole thing from the start, because none of it makes sense without it. If you're new here on Dark Revenge, this is where I tell real, patient stories about families, exes, and in-laws who forget where the line is, and the kind of revenge that never once has to raise its voice. Welcome. If that's your kind of story, go ahead and hit like now and subscribe, because I promise you this one earns it. Now let me take you back to where it actually started. My name is Amelia James. I'm 33, and I'm a structural engineer. I spend my weekdays walking through century-old buildings in Grand Rapids with a laser level and a flashlight, telling clients which cracks in a foundation are cosmetic and which ones mean a wall needs to come down. It's a strange skill to be good at. You learn to look at something everyone calls solid and see exactly where it's already failing. I live 20 minutes from where I grew up, in a rented duplex on Larch Street in Millhaven, Michigan, population just under 6,000, the kind of town where the hardware store knows your name and the diner on Main, Vera's, still writes your order on a paper ticket. I drive a 10-year-old Subaru Outback with a torque wrench rolling around in the back seat because you never really stop being an engineer, even on a Saturday. I'm not someone who yells. When something's wrong, I go quiet and start checking the load-bearing parts, figuratively, and more than once professionally. My mother says I came out of the womb reading the instruction manual. My younger brother Tyler, 26, drives an ambulance for Millhaven EMS, and says I'm the only person he knows who reads a home inspection report for fun. Every year of my life, my family has hosted the 4th of July on our dock at 14, Shoreline Drive on Birch Lake. It started in 1975, when my grandfather Walter James, 84 now, still sharper than most people half his age, built that dock with his own hands and decided the whole town should get to use it one day a year. Folding chairs, a flag he still raises himself at 9 sharp, my mother's blueberry buckle, and a guest book that's been sitting in a cedar box on our mantel since Gerald Ford was president. You need to understand what that dock means before I tell you what almost happened to it. And for that, I have to take you back to when I was 9, and my family nearly lost everything a different way. When I was 9, my father's home inspection business nearly went under. It was a bad stretch for the housing market in West Michigan. Work dried up for almost a year, and I remember the particular sound of my parents' voices through the floor vent in my bedroom. Not shouting, just low and tired and afraid, which is somehow worse. I didn't understand mortgages at 9. I understood that my dad stopped whistling in the garage, and my mom started clipping coupons with a grim focus that scared me more than any argument would have. I became the kid who smoothed things over. If Tyler and I fought, I ended it before it reached our parents. If dinner went quiet, I filled it with questions about nothing, just to keep the silence from getting heavy. I got very good, very young, at making myself small enough to keep the peace in a room. I didn't know yet that habit would follow me into my 30s. The one place that never felt uncertain was my grandfather's dock. Every July, no matter how bad things were at home, we went to Birch Lake, and for one day the world felt solid. It was the one tradition my parents never once considered skipping, even the summer we were behind on the electric bill. The Ashfords moved to Millhaven the year I turned 10. Gary Ashford bought the old hardware store on Fenwick Street and reopened it as Ashford Hardware, with his wife Patricia doing the books and their son Connor, a year older than me, riding his bike past our house every afternoon like he was scouting for friends. My grandfather, who has never met a new family in town he didn't immediately invite to something, showed up at the store with a flyer for the 4th of July before the paint on the sign was dry. Blood gets you in the door, Amelia, he told me once, drying his hands on a dish towel. Sticking around, that's what actually makes you family. The Ashfords showed up that July, and they kept showing up every single year for the next 23 of them. Connor and I became friends before we became anything else, building forts off the end of the dock, arguing over whose turn it was to hold the flag rope. I had no idea the year I'd meet the person who'd try to walk off with that dock entirely was already sitting somewhere on a calendar. Nobody warns you about that kind of thing in advance. Connor and I started dating for real the summer after my sophomore year of college. It felt inevitable, the way things do when two families have shared a dock for a decade. We got engaged the October I turned 30. At the end of that same dock, my grandfather's old flag folded on the bench beside us like a kind of blessing. The cracks started 3 years earlier, though I didn't read them correctly at the time. Big box stores opened 40 minutes away, and Ashford Hardware couldn't compete on price. Gary had a stroke behind the counter on a Tuesday in March, the same week the store's lease came up for renewal. Patricia closed the hardware store within the year and rebranded the family business as Ashford Realty and Construction, flipping small properties, doing renovation work around the county. Connor, who'd been contracting on the side anyway, came in as her partner. It should have been a fresh start. For a while it was, but the language around our family's lake property shifted in small ways I noticed and said nothing about, because that's what I'd trained myself to do since I was 9. Patricia started saying, "Once we redo the dock," instead of "once you redo the dock." Connor pitched an idea at Sunday dinners about building a couple of rental cabins along our shoreline as a family investment, his crew doing the construction, splitting the income. My father said no. More than once. I told myself it was just enthusiasm. Two families that tangled up for 20 years blur their pronouns sometimes. Then, 14 months before that last 4th of July, I found out it meant something else. It was a Tuesday in April. Connor had left his work tablet open on the counter while he showered, still logged into a renovation jobs group text. A bathroom remodel for a client named Sydney Reyes. I wasn't looking for anything. I was looking for the Wi-Fi password. What I found instead was 3 months of messages that had nothing to do with towel samples. I didn't scream. I sat at the kitchen table with his tablet until he came out in a towel, and I asked him one question, the same kind of question I'd ask again 14 months later, standing on that dock. How long? He didn't lie about the answer, which I've since decided is the one decent thing he did that whole conversation. 5 months. He moved out by that Friday. What I didn't know yet was that the breakup hadn't ended the Ashfords' interest in our shoreline. If anything, it seemed to focus it. Breakups don't actually separate anyone in a town of 6,000 people. Connor and I still ran into each other at Vera's at the gas station at the 4th of July because our families had shared a dock since before either of us could walk. My dad kept hosting because Gary had been like a brother to him for 2 decades. Stroke or no stroke, real estate pivot or no real estate pivot. But that winter, the language kept shifting. At a church potluck in February, Ruth Callahan, who's lived 2 doors from my parents my whole life and doesn't miss much, told my mother that Patricia had been mentioning to more than one person that some changes are coming to the lake situation, exciting ones for the Ashfords. My mother relayed this to me with the exact tone of someone reporting a leak in the ceiling. Asterisk, probably nothing. Probably just Patricia being Patricia. Asterisk. I let it go. Then, one Saturday morning in April, walking the shoreline path with my coffee, I saw 2 wooden stakes with orange flagging near our western property line, each stamped with a small metal tag. Baxter Land Surveying, Grand Haven, MI. I asked my dad if he'd hired a surveyor. He hadn't. I asked my grandfather. He hadn't either, not since the county resurveyed the whole shoreline back in the 90s. I called Baxter Land Surveying myself the following Monday. From my car outside a 19th century church, I was there to inspect a cracked bell tower foundation in. The receptionist wouldn't confirm the client confidentiality, reasonably enough. But she let it slip, almost as an afterthought, that the request had come in tagged boundary clarification, adjacent parcel use documentation, filed under a business account. I asked which business. She paused just long enough for me to know she shouldn't answer. Then she told me anyway. Ashford Realty and Construction. I didn't call Connor. I didn't call Patricia. On a colleague's recommendation, I called a real estate attorney named Renata Alvarez, whose office sits above a bakery on Fulton Street and smells permanently of cinnamon rolls, a strange backdrop for the conversation we were about to have. I laid it all out. The stakes, the church comments, the boat lift Gary had asked to keep on our docks west, and the summer I turned 18, 15 years ago that July, and my grandfather's easy, Generous, yes, because that's who he is. Renata wasn't surprised. Under Michigan law, she explained, if someone uses part of your property openly, continuously, and under a claim of right for 15 years, they can potentially establish a prescriptive easement, a legal right to keep using that section, even against your wishes. There's one thing that kills a claim like that every time, though, she said, sliding her glasses up her nose. Permission. If the use was invited, not just tolerated, it was never hostile. And if it was never hostile, the clock never even starts. I thought about that word, invited, the whole drive home. Somewhere around the exit for Route 9, I thought about the cedar box on my grandmother's mantel. That night, Grandpa Walter and I sat on his living room floor with a 50-year-old leather guest book spread across both our laps. Every July since 1975, at the top of that year's page, in his steady handwriting, "Welcome, friends, to Independence Day at the Jameses." Every summer since I turned 18, Gary's signature is there. Patricia's, Connor's. 15 straight years of proof they'd never been anything but guests. He's going to need more than a boat lift and a signature to take the stock, my grandfather said quietly, closing the book. But I have a feeling that's not all he's planning. He was right. 2 weeks before the 4th, Ruth Callahan stopped my mother in the cereal aisle and asked, gently, whether Walter had signed something over to the Ashfords years back. Patricia had shown her a photocopy at a church fundraiser. A letter, dated the year I turned 18, granting the Ashfords permanent access and use rights to the West Dock and adjacent lawn for so long as our families remain close, signed Walter James. My grandfather has never once needed a lawyer to write him a letter, and he's never signed his name with the loop that photocopy had on the W. When I showed him the photo, he looked at it a long moment and said only, "I didn't write that." Renata had one more piece of advice. Let Patricia's calls happen, and let them record. Michigan only requires one party's consent. Patricia called me on June the 28th, ostensibly about wedding logistics, and somewhere in the middle of seating charts, mentioned, almost cheerfully, that once the 15 years hit the summer, our attorney says we'll finally have something real to stand on. We just have to be smart about how we talk about how it started. I didn't say a word. I let her keep talking. On July 3rd, Renata filed a sworn affidavit at the Ottawa County Register of Deeds on our behalf, the guest book photographs, the original flyer, a notarized statement from my grandfather, establishing on the public record that every year of Ashford use had been by express invitation. I packed a folder into a blue canvas tote bag that night and set it by the door. I had no idea I'd need to bring it the very next morning. I assumed, foolishly, that having it ready would be enough. The morning of the 4th was 89 degrees by 10, the kind of thick Michigan heat that leaves a flag hanging still until the wind finally picks up. My grandfather raised it at 9 sharp, though this year Tyler stood close enough to catch him on the ladder. My mother's blueberry buckle was on the dessert table by 10:30, beside Ruth Callahan's deviled eggs. By 11, the yard held maybe 130 people, spread across lawn chairs and picnic blankets. Connor arrived a little after 11 with Sidney Reyes, who I'd never actually met in person, and who spent the morning holding a plate she wasn't eating from and glancing at Patricia like she was checking for a cue. Patricia arrived carrying a cream folder with a metal clasp and something else tucked under her arm. Around noon, Connor walked over to the small speaker my grandfather sets up every year for his 1 o'clock toast and picked up the microphone 20 minutes early. The yard quieted the way it does when someone taps a glass at a wedding. "I know this isn't really my toast to give," he started, and a few people laughed. "Easy, the way you laugh when you don't yet know what's coming." He announced his engagement to Sydney, real applause, a few whoops. Her smile in that moment was the most genuine thing I saw from her all day, and I meant it when I clapped. None of what happened next was about her. Then he kept talking. "Sydney and I have been thinking about this place a lot lately. This tradition means so much to my family. It has for 15 years now, and we've been talking about taking on more of the hosting going forward. Maybe even permanently once we're married." He glanced at Patricia, already nodding, already holding up her folder like a prop. Then he looked at me. "Actually, Ames, no hard feelings, but I think it might be time you sat this one out. New chapter, right?" The yard didn't go silent right away. There was a beat of confused laughter, a couple of people assuming it was some joke between exes. Then people saw my mother's face and my grandfather setting his coffee cup down on the arm of his lawn chair with a very particular kind of care. Patricia stepped forward holding up what she'd carried, programs, printed on real cardstock, ordered from a shop with a 50-copy minimum. Ashford Family 4th of July celebration, above a photo of the dock I've walked my entire life. I set my lemonade down. I reached for the tote bag at my feet, the one I'd almost decided not to bring. And I asked my grandfather, loud enough for the whole yard to hear, "Grandpa, did you ever write Patricia a letter promising the Ashfords permanent use of this dock?" He didn't hesitate. "No," he said. "I did not." That was the moment Connor Ashford stopped smiling. Patricia recovered fast. I'll give her that. "Walter, you signed it years ago, don't you remember? It was right after Gary and I." My grandfather just shook his head, the way he used to when Tyler or I tried talking our way out of a chore. "Patricia, I've known you 23 years. I have never written you a legal letter about anything in my life, and I've certainly never signed my name with that hook you've got on the W in that copy you keep showing people." A ripple went through the crowd. Ruth Callahan, cane across her lap, said loud enough to carry, "I saw that letter at the spring fundraiser, Patricia. You told me it was practically a done deal." Sydney turned to Connor with an expression I recognized instantly because I'd worn it myself once, 14 months earlier, at my own kitchen table. "What letter?" Connor didn't answer her. I don't think he had one. I pulled a manila folder from the tote bag and held up the top page. A photograph of a guest book entry from 15 summers ago, my grandfather's handwriting fading blue at the top. "Welcome, friends, to Independence Day at the Jameses." Below it, Gary's careful block print, Patricia's looping signature, a 12-year-old Connor's crooked one. Every year the Ashfords came to this dock, they signed a page that opens with the words "Welcome and guests," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. 15 years of that isn't a tradition changing hands. That's 15 years of being invited. Nobody laughed this time. I looked at Patricia. "You commissioned a survey from Baxter Land Surveying in April on our property without telling my father or my grandfather. I have that on record too." Her mouth opened and closed. Connor looked at his mother like he was seeing something for the first time, and for one strange second I almost felt sorry for him. "Almost. There's more," I said, meaning it as a warning, not a threat. "But I don't think this is the place for the rest of it." It was, as it turned out, exactly the place. Because that's when a man in a golf shirt none of us had noticed by the parking area, Dale Whitcomb, started walking toward the microphone. Before I tell you why a real estate developer was standing at the edge of my family's 4th of July picnic, quick pause. If you've ever watched someone try to rewrite your family's history in front of everyone you know, and you understand exactly how my stomach felt in that moment, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read every one. And if you're not subscribed to Dark Revenge yet, this is usually right around where these stories turn. You might want to fix that now. Here's who Dale Whitcomb was and why he mattered. Here's what I didn't fully understand until 4 days before the picnic. When Renata called with what she'd found combing public county and business filings, the Ashfords weren't trying to take our whole dock. They didn't need to. They needed just enough of a legal claim to make the property next door look valuable to somebody else. The old Lakeview Motel sits on 2 acres beside us, half empty since I was in high school, and Ashford Realty had picked it up cheap 2 years earlier. The problem, if you're selling it as lake real estate, is that its own shoreline is mostly marsh, too soft for a real dock. Our shoreline, the one my grandfather built on in 1975, is the only deep, usable water access on that whole stretch. Whoever controlled legal access to our water controlled what the Lakeview was actually worth. 4 months earlier, Ashford Realty had signed a conditional purchase agreement with Alderan Bay Development Group, a marina developer out of Grand Haven, run by Dale Whitcomb, for $1.2 million. Renata found it recorded in plain public view. The sale was contingent on Ashford Realty delivering, in writing, documented and legally defensible lake access rights to the neighboring parcel within 12 months of signing. 12 months from that date landed right around the 15th anniversary of Gary's boat lift. That wasn't a coincidence. That was the plan. Patricia needed a paper trail that made a yearly kindness look like a permanent right, and she needed the town to believe the transfer was already underway, so if we pushed back, it would look like sour grapes from a jilted ex-fiancé instead of a family protecting what was always legally theirs. The letter, the programs, the church comments, None of it was really about my grandfather's guest book. It was about closing $1 million deal before anyone thought to check the paperwork. I'd learned all of it 4 days before the picnic. I brought copies of the purchase agreement into that tote bag along with everything else. Which is why, when Dale Whitcomb crossed our lawn past kids with unlit sparklers and asked Patricia, quietly, not quietly enough, is there a problem with the access rights? My attorney flagged a filing at the county yesterday, and I drove out personally to hear it wasn't true. The whole yard already knew the answer before Patricia did. I stepped forward and handed him a copy of what Renata had filed the day before, the affidavit, the guest book photographs, my grandfather's notarized statement that no permanent access had ever been granted to anyone. Dale read it standing in the middle of my family's picnic, in the heat. A paper plate of my mother's blueberry buckle someone had handed him out of pure Midwestern reflex, still balanced in his other hand. Then he looked at Patricia and said the only thing that mattered. This isn't what you represented to us. That was the twist nobody at that picnic saw coming, not even Connor, I think. The whole thing had never really been about me. I was just standing on top of the only thing that made their deal worth anything. Nothing about what happened next involved a raised voice, which is part of why it worked. Dale's attorney sent a formal letter within the week, terminating the purchase agreement on the Lakeview parcel, citing misrepresentation regarding access rights material to the transaction. Renata told me Alder & Bay had already been uneasy about inconsistencies in the survey paperwork. The affidavit and the guest book just gave them the exit they needed. Ashford Realty, it turned out, had already used the anticipated sale proceeds as leverage to refinance an old defaulted loan from the hardware store days, the kind of move you make when you're confident a deal is closing. When it didn't, the bank didn't wait. Within 2 months, Patricia had to list 2 rental properties just to stay current. I found out about the state licensing complaint from Renata, not because I filed it. A misrepresentation by a license broker doesn't stay quiet for long once the other party's attorney has a duty to report it. Patricia's broker license went under state review that August. There was a moment in Renata's office, the same chair I'd sat in back in April, when she laid out one more option. You could still refer the letter to the county prosecutor, she said plainly. Forgery, uttering and publishing, that's a felony here, and you'd have a strong case. No pressure either way. Just the facts, the way a good attorney gives them to you. I sat with it for a few days. I thought about the version of me, who used to make herself small at the dinner table to keep the peace, and whether pursuing a criminal charge against Connor's mother would actually give me anything I didn't already have. The deal was dead. The lie was public. My grandfather's dock was more protected, legally, than it had been in 50 years. 2 more years of my life in a courtroom over a boat lift wasn't going to add to that. No, I told Renata. I just needed it to stop. It stopped. I still wonder sometimes whether that was mercy or just exhaustion wearing a nicer name. I haven't taken it back, and I've thought about that decision more than almost any other one I made that year. I land in the same place every time. What I didn't decline was making sure the record stayed clean. Renata's affidavit is permanent now, filed at the Ottawa County Register of Deeds beside the original 1975 deed. Anyone who ever pulls the title on our shoreline again will find exactly what happened, in writing forever. Word moves fast in a town of 6,000, even when nobody involved says a thing publicly. Court filings are public record, and plenty of people in Millhaven know how to read a deed. By August, the version going around Vera's wasn't the Ashfords and the Jameses had a falling out. It was closer to the truth. Ashford Realty didn't lose their business overnight. Small towns are gentler than that, and crueler in their own slow way. They just stopped getting called first. Jobs that used to come automatically started going to a contractor 2 towns over. By winter, Patricia had let her office lease go and was working out of a spare room, a quiet consequence that doesn't make headlines but changes a life all the same. Gary Ashford came to see my father that September, alone, driving himself for the first time since his stroke. He sat on our porch 20 minutes. My dad told me afterward Gary mostly said he was sorry that he hadn't known about the letter until it was already circulating, and that he still remembered the day my grandfather showed up at his brand-new store with a flyer before the paint had dried. My dad believed him. I think I do too. Brooke Ashford lost her paralegal job at Danvers and Whitfield that fall. Once it came out she'd used firm research time to help her mother look into the 15-year statute in the first place. Connor and Sydney's wedding loosely planned for that October, never happened. Sydney moved out of their shared apartment sometime in September. I don't know the specifics, and they're not mine to know. I'll say this much. Hearing what letter come out of her mouth in real time, at that microphone, isn't a memory I take any satisfaction in. She didn't do anything wrong. She just believed people who were lying to everyone, including, I think, themselves. The following June, I brought in a contractor to replace 6 boards on the docks west end that had been quietly rotting under Gary's old boat lift for years. Nobody had looked closely at that section in a long time. His name was Marcus Hale. He does timber frame restoration, the real kind, where you find out exactly how deep the rot goes and replace only what needs it. We spent 3 Saturdays that spring arguing cheerfully about cedar versus treated pine, and by the 4th I noticed I was finding reasons to ask him questions I already knew the answers to. It didn't turn into some grand romance overnight. It turned into something steadier than that, which by now you probably understand is exactly the kind of thing I trust. That next 4th of July was smaller. Fewer casseroles, no printed programs from anyone but my mother, still slightly crooked from the home printer. My grandfather raised the flag at 9, though these days he lets Tyler do the climbing and just calls out instructions from the ground. The guest book came out of its cedar box, same as every July since 1975, and new names went into it. Marcus's among them, written a little self-consciously under the same line my grandfather has opened every page with for 50 years. Welcome, friends. I ran into Connor once that spring in the paint aisle of a hardware store 2 towns over. We nodded. Neither of us said anything, and neither of us needed to. It wasn't cold. It just wasn't anything anymore, which is its own kind of peace, and one I didn't expect to feel this easily. I think about my grandfather's line a lot. Blood getting you in the door, sticking around being what makes you family. I used to think it was about the Ashfords, back when we were all still guests at each other's tables. I understand it differently now. It was never really about them. It was about the dock itself, and the guest book, and 50 years of a family choosing, on purpose, every single July, to be generous with something that was always, unmistakably, theirs to give. Nobody manufactures that kind of belonging with a survey stake and a forged signature. You either build it, board by board, for 50 years, or you don't. I don't think the Ashfords ever understood the difference. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from this, it's not that I won exactly. I think of it differently. Someone tried to convince a whole town that patience and generosity were the same thing as ownership, and the only reason it didn't work is that my grandfather, without ever meaning to, spent 50 years turning kindness into a paper trail. Every signature in that guest book was a gift. It just also turned out to be evidence. I still host the 4th of July, some years with my parents, more of it on my own now. The guest book still opens with the same line it always has. People still sign it without thinking twice, the way you don't think twice about a kindness while you're receiving it. That's the whole point. So here's what I keep coming back to. If someone disappears from being generous with you and starts talking about what's theirs the moment money enters the picture, what does that actually tell you about the relationship the whole time? I'd genuinely like to know what you think. Tell me in the comments. I read every one. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that quiet and patient can still win. And if you're new here, this is Dark Revenge. Every week I bring you true feeling stories about toxic families, exes who forget their place, and justice that never has to raise its voice to be final. If that's the corner of the internet you want to keep coming back to, subscribe now, because the next story is already coming, and it's just as unbelievable as this one. I'll see you in the next one.